Hello everyone, today we talk about the monetization of the military service in 13th century Europe. It's a wide and complex topic that we somewhat already discussed, looking chiefly about the costs of war, the awakening of the European armor at this point in this century in history, the degree of professionalization of the medieval armies does start consistently at this point, and more broadly speaking, the dynamization of European trade and economy, and the spread of currency, and this broader change that could be reassumed in a shift from a Naturwirtschaft to a Geldwirtschaft. This is very important in European history because obviously the 13th century is this really this turning point, whatever you want to see it. European economy was rising, from chiefly the 10th century in a pretty consistent way, and there had been an acceleration towards the 11th to 12th century. But in the 3rd century, you have this moment of great monetization, great expansion of trade, and consequently in the war market of an increase of professionalization and the increase of paying in money. And this was a big change because the system that was formed at this point was essentially surpassing the old feudal one that was ideally let's say based on natural goods and barter, or however it was largely part of a rural dimension where economy was very poor, where surplus was very weak, and in which in fact the preconditions for essentially providing a professional military service was owning land. At this point, the thing doesn't quite change, but the degree of monetization is very high, for which not only those who possess a piece of land, in many ways that could be even outside the feudal system, the feudal hierarchy proper, are able to arm themselves, to purchase weaponry, and participating to long-range expeditions that at that point were not even connected properly to the boundaries of the feudal entity of reference, and that looked now something bigger. And this is the same century in which in fact the European monarchies start to give themselves kind of a relatively more centralized order, with certain functionaries now that have to do even with the collection of money, of taxes, etc. So it's a world that is changing very, very rapidly, and there are many interesting things happening in it. I must say, I have a soft spot. I mean, I love the 13th century as a whole. I would let's say I always have this very attentive look at it, because I believe that was a crucial moment in which lots of things started to happen that eventually fully developed in the 14th century and are important to look at them now. And this one is particularly interesting. Even the birth of the mercenary companies that we mostly think as a 14th and 15th century phenomenon actually started to exist in a structural fashion already in the 13th century. Actually, mercenary companies always existed. They weren't really anything new in European warfare as in anyone else's, but let's say that in the 13th century the difference is that this becomes systemic, it becomes structural. And we will see now through, as I was saying before, this is a very wide topic, so today we will essentially make a list of examples of how the military retributions now were being paid in money fundamentally, and not anymore entailed as a duty, as a regular duty of the feudatory towards the lord. This is also the very important premise that we have to bear in mind, is that the feudal system ideally had been born as in itself an already a prepaid service fundamentally for those who received the beneficium. That is to say, I don't give you land because you're sympathetic to me. Okay, maybe you're faithful soldier, etc. But I give you that land, which theoretically, as a king, that theoretically is mine as a king, in order for you to have already the necessary amount of resources that you draw from that land in order to equip yourself as a professional fighter. This thing started with a substantial degree of approximation as a regular practice in the 8th century with the Carolingians, and it already entailed at the time a mounted military service. So a great expense, like having a horse, an armor, weaponry, and all what it was needed, even in terms of just obviously caloric consumptions for training, because professionalism is not something that you gain just by going to war, but also preparing for war, being trained, etc. So at this point we are arrived at a moment in which feudalism reached its apex, and at a certain point starts to transform into something else that is, to take it very far, let's say, is the moment of creation of those systems that were born kind of accidentally. Actually, historiographically it's very debated, but that were to evolve, in fact, in a couple of centuries in those modern states that emerged as chiefly from these feudal monarchies. We're talking chiefly about, actually, chiefly Western Europe proper, like Britain, France, the Iberian Peninsula, but also obviously in other Central Europe and Eastern European regions. So what we will be observing now are examples that show us how the change occurred, passing from this increased payment in gold that before in money, whichever it was, preferably in gold, of course, that before, let's say, was not, let's say, it's not that it didn't quite exist, because actually a form of monetization always on the table. Everything could be commuted in a way or another, and the monetization is something that, albeit rare, existed already before, actually. But at this point we see how fast and this practice had accelerated, and by the 13th century what we see is actually the now the full the normal habit arrived at this point of this practice, in using this practice. So and you can understand you can find examples of this commutation actually all over the place now. Think about even in previous times the scutage, actually scutage or scutage, depending on which side of the channel you live in, and that was this tax basically levied on the holders of a knight's fee under the feudal land tenure of a knight's service. So basically it obviously equated to the commutation in not necessarily money, actually, but even in a individual commutation, like throughout all the Middle Ages, as we were saying before, the base of the patrimonial of wealth, let's say, in general, was the landed property, right? So whoever owned this landed property had a duty to provide a certain amount of troops, military service, to the sovereign. Now the problem is that many people didn't want to go to war. As always, they preferred to remain at home and to pay something in exchange. Now this exchange could be made of other people who went to war for you, and this especially started happening when war, especially at this time in war, was becoming a pretty lucrative business, so that people kind of put their life on considering the risk on a scale, and said, is it convenient to go to war for raiding, for pillaging, for getting actually paid? Now we will see that, because there were additional salaries, and the two things sometimes went in parallel, right? So there was still the feudal duty, and we will see it perfectly afterwards, and the paid service at the same time. It was very hybrid at that point. Or you could simply, in fact, pay for your own military service. That actually is something very intelligent to do, because that's what money, what the currency is actually, what actually serves to, is that you don't actually physically shift entire men and animals and equipment, but you just send money, this precious metal, in tiny bits, so that you can use it somewhere else to hire the increasing number of professionals of war that are appearing, as a matter of fact, on the market now, including those people who had made actually who had the similar were coming from the same system of feudal recruitment, meaning that at this time most of the professional mercenaries that you find around are not really people coming from nowhere, but most of the times these were noblemen who actually invested with their own assets, the ones that they protected so much from the royal authority, into the business of war. And this could happen not just at a local level, but you find people from all over Europe that are fundamentally going to find somewhere where there is job in this sense, because it was a job. War has always been like this, and there's nothing surprising about it. And so it was even an advantage. It corresponds, if you want, to progress, that we tend to still to stick to the romantic prejudice of the 19th century, where the mercenary is a sort of scumbag who just fights for money. Why? Because what other people do fight for? I mean, money are just a quantifier of goods, and everybody fights for goods, whichever they are. So it's pretty naive to believe that. And actually, if you look at the professionals of war, especially at this time, you realize that mercenaries were far more reliable, as a matter of fact, as professional troops than runaway troops and other feudal levies, etc. So that even the feelings of belonging, of commitment to the various political causes and identities were pretty loose. So the scutage is a pretty good example of that, because it stems directly from the feudal system in itself. So under feudalism, the king, through his vassals, provided land to knights for their support, as we've seen, and this military service was expecting in return. So the knights were allowed literally to buy out of the military service by paying scutage, right? And as the time passed, actually the kings began to impose a scutage on holder knights' fees, even in time of peace, which means that the feudal levy was in fact normally called in case of emergency, of need, right? This starts being regulated now on a much more periodical base, that in fact is not related anymore, that is becoming very, very ideal, even on paper. Like you look at these, you realize that there is a lag between the what was actually required to the feudal levies in terms of service, and what was happening in real war actually, and how long campaigns lasted. Because, by the way, the feudal levies were normally quantified in days of service. It wasn't even about money proper. It was really for how many days, and especially also where. Like usually the feudal levies had to be called for either the defense of the fief in itself, or the whole kingdom. But it was very expensive to make even these troops moving across the country itself. So everything was very complicated. And what you see, especially at this time, is that there were troops participating for those given days, and then you find them continuing to be there, and you realize that they were there because at this point they were paid in turn. So this is very important, because the feudal system had completely gone in the other how do you say, upside down. Yeah, right. So it's not at this point that you have land, and therefore in order to fight for the king, but it's the king now that asks for you for military service, that pays you actually for military service. and while you keep having your land, which you do whatever you do with. So this obviously corresponds to a very to a weakening of the feudal system proper. Not much of the authority of the kings, as you may expect. We'll see now that actually the kings were the first beneficiary in many ways of this increased monetization. Were able to expand their power through it, but we will explain it later. So, for instance, this was today we will look at examples chiefly from France, Sicily, Italy, and England that are kind of some of the best places, obviously documented at the time. Starting from France, it's very interesting because you know that in the 13th century, France has this rocketing phase in which the monarchy is able finally to progressively get rid of this the pressure of the vassals to create a pretty solid domain into France to expand throughout all the territories to arrive up to the Mediterranean. This owed a lot to the reign of Philip Augustus, that is naturally one of the greatest French kings, probably the second in importance after Louis XIV, and he is mostly famous from this military point of view, obviously because of his wars against England for the Battle of Bouvines. But aside from the key events that we all kind of know, what is interesting is how that was achieved fundamentally. And you realize that in France, the king was the one that pushed the most for the monetization of the military service. From one side, you have that obviously also France is becoming kind of rich, so there is this bourgeoisie rising. This is particularly useful for the king to counter even the feudal nobility. But at the same time, there's a sort of gentrification of certain communities for which they start to prefer to pay rather than to serve actually in person. And this therefore owes not just to the political direction it was given, but to the system that structurally was growing by itself, systemically speaking. And you find that by the years 1202, 1203, basically all the cities that owed a military service to Philip Augustus did not send troops, the normal sergeant, but rather money. So that's quite meaningful, because in France what happens at a certain point is that Philip II, in order to get rid of the feudal nobility, was to impose, and now he sent them in the full war against England actually. He gets rid of them. He sends them fighting the Albigensian Crusade in the south of France. And which is a bath of blood. Some of the finest, of the highest the flower of French nobility dies there. Think about Simon de Montfort, etc. And it's a very and it was pretty clever, because southern France was pretty rich, pretty fragmented. So it was the perfect bait for it. Just lacked the religious formality of the crusade to go there, and what Philip II fights with is mercenaries at that point. That is not feudal levies, but guys that had hired now through money, and with whom actually he manages to defeat the English and to recover actually all the Normandy, so all the greatest territories, almost all of the territories of English France at this point, if you can call it that way, and starting from this, it also sets a trend that is based, in fact, also on the administration that is deputed to manage gold, to manage money, to manage this military administration that was evidently needed. So also using and co-opting this middle class, these commoners that were now kind of literate and could work in the administration and so on. In 1227, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen king of Sicily, while preparing his crusade, he ordered in his kingdom that every feudatory has to give for each fief actually 8 ounces of gold, and that 8 fiefs shall give a knight. So this is very interesting because it was what I was telling you before, is that you in this disposition you find both the material, the physical levy, and the monetized one at the same time. And if you look at this, if you do the maths in here, it turns out that from this group of 8 fiefs, from which a single knight has to be provided for the military service, you will have 8 ounces of gold for each, that is 64 ounces of gold, which turns out is exactly, or roughly at least, at the time, the pay for 1 year of service. So basically from this district of 8, this group of 8 fiefs, he managed to draw one, not just a knight, so the physical guy with armor, a war horse, other horses, probably obviously assistants, shield bearers, etc., but also all the money that was needed for paying this guy for his service for an entire year, at least for what it was on the market, I believe at the time, one year of pay. So you basically solve both the logistical problem, because obviously the knight had somewhat to provide for his own, just for his own equipment, but also for his supplies. Naturally, we can see even at this time a sort of, obviously not of centralization as we mean it, but naturally those same money that were required now were used for organizing other expenses. There was a sort of collective organization. You don't have to think that in history there's ever been the literal peasant soldier who went with all of the weaponry and the supplies to war, and that was enough for it. There was always some sort of degree of centralized organization and military administration. But nevertheless, that's still a pretty substantial ratio. And by the way, the Kingdom of Sicily, in this sense, was a kingdom that had a pretty good military administration at the time. It had been shaped, molded by the Normans back in the day, in a way that it could, control especially the feudal levies at this point, countering their power. So it wasn't like in France, for instance, where the struggle for emerging over the vassals was something very, very, very tiring and very slow. There was this kind of more centralized asset there, so they had probably made the maths, and the social engineer had figured out how to make this resources popping out. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. So looking north, if you look at the Papal States at this point, in 1255, we know that certain communes of St. Peter's patrimony preferred to pay rather than to send, to pay for rather than to send inhabitants to the military service. So this is also pretty normal. There were certain cities in here, certain communes that had to provide for the church, for the Pope, the necessary troops, but they were kind of they didn't want to, so they preferred to say, okay, we pay what the corresponding, and we don't go to war. You just raise some troops on this regard. So this money that was collected and made available, and that you can call easily sort of public money at this point, because it was effectively deriving from the public's wealth. It was raised, was collected by the community. Now was definitely served for first of all to obviously pay to compensate all the different types of military duties but allowing at the same time to consolidate the same and to surpass in the traditional boundaries of time and space that had henceforth diminished, greatly diminished actually its reach. And that's what we were telling before. That is now, if you have the money for making people going to war, you can, as long as you keep this money with you, which happened. That's why also the military camps were so easily targeted during the battles, even where soldiers stopped fighting just to go pillage them, because there was the physical wealth in there, the physical riches that were used even to hire troops on the spot, and that represented in fact the financially attractiveness of these powers, like represented by those who were fighting on the field, so that by the kings and monarchs that were in general at this time still very, very heavily committed into the military operations in person, right? So this is a great improvement actually for the same monarchic authority, because before, in the ideal feudal system, what you had to rely on was on this very great sense of fealty, of connection, of loyalty of the vassal towards the sovereign, that was granted in different ways at that point. That was to appoint new feudatories, giving them land, entrusting them land and consigning them land, so that there was an effective competition in this sense. But once these guys had gotten the land, the beneficium, then they were kind of powerful on their own, and when the bond of trust, of friendship with the Lord stopped, it was pretty complicated to call them back, to actually even just to make them fight for you. So it was literally just a request. Obviously, in a fragmented world like the feudal one it was pretty easy to commit individual feudatories to fight for the king, because usually there was always someone who had an interest in common to not make the monarchy too strong or too weak. Too weak in this case. So to make the whole system disrupting, but it was still based on this kind of balance where the king didn't have quite of a direct effective power and that's where the surplus of European economy in the 13th century starts. I would say as it's a normal tendency in societies to flow into the hands just of now the administration of the government, and being used for expanding the prerogatives of this same government, as a matter of fact. So and therefore to consolidate a method of payment or retribution that up to this point was rather unknown, at least in its in such a dimension, right? So at this point, as we were saying before, you could call people outside of the boundaries of the fief, and even for a longer time than the one that was traditionally required by the same concession, by same of the king. Actually, there was that had been up to that point obliged to bargain, to negotiate the military service of all the various feudatories. So at this point, as long as you had money, you could bring people literally everywhere you wanted, and as long, obviously, that those were enormous expenses as well. So even resources were not terribly limitless, but the unlimited, the idea is that still at that point even the physical temporal boundaries do not matter anymore, because and the same feudal system is tearing apart in the process. It's basically the same thing. Obviously, there was a moment of refeudalization in European history, incidentally, just after the crisis of the Black Death, that contracted all the markets and the currency as well. So, but that tells you what the trend was, and how these systems were evolving constantly. If you look into central Italy, into communes like Perugia and Florence during the 13th century, the communal militias are paid since the very first day of the campaign. Now, this is also pretty interesting because in this case the militias are troops that are self-committed to the commune. So theoretically the commune here is acting like the king, given that especially these communes are rather autonomous. So but even in here there were people who said, I don't actually want to go to fight just for the sake of it, I need to be paid. Also because, well, for the knights it was actually very inviting to go fighting, because that was what their main income made grow their income so much, with reigning and pillaging direct and these activities that were all one with other commercial businesses, etc. But the commoners, especially the infantry, etc., said, but we have to work, we're artisans, we're merchants, we're professionals of other kinds of, like, if we go to war, we lose money fundamentally, and this was a big problem, because in turn those were the guys who who produced, I don't know, the shoeing for the horses, the armors, the weaponry. So you couldn't even make these guys participating to war constantly, because otherwise the whole commune would have gone bankrupted together with all the knightly class. So there were many, by the way, many different systems of retribution for military losses, especially for the knights, for war horses. It was especially a great business in there. You can even measure the political thermometer through. But looking at the whole spectrum of the troops, you realize that there are 5 solidi for an infantryman at the beginning of the campaign. 10 for a knight with a horse, 15 for a knight with 2 horses. This is in the case of Perugia, by the way. So you realize even here the measure. So an infantryman is paid at the beginning a half of a knight with only one horse, and 1/3 of a knight with 2 horses. In Florence, instead, what you have is 3 solidi for the crossbowmen, 2 solidi and 8 denarii for the archers, 2 solidi and 6 denarii for the pavismen. Fundamentally, were essentially specialized infantry with pavis shields. Were kind of there is all a great debate actually about what the pavis really were, because the vulgata is that fundamentally they were this kind of door-like shield that was fixed on the ground. But it turns out that at this time, in the 13th century, was something probably not even so big. It was probably used way more dynamically than in later times, where we actually have archaeological evidence of. But aside from this, you see that that they're paid less actually than both the crossbowmen and the archers. So and 2 solidi for the ordinary infantrymen of the Florentine army. So in other words, you can see here the degree of specialization and the effectiveness even of and importance of crossbowmen at this point, that are paid fundamentally 50% more than the average infantryman. It's pretty interesting. Infantry warfare, yes, definitely, but also crossbows were increasing dramatically in importance during this time, and they, especially in this area of Europe, and it's not a surprise to see these proportions in the pay. By the way, these were areas that were also pretty heavily monetized, as we know. So monetary economy was pretty intense. So looking at England, since 1193, the 500 servientes in Latin, so surgeons, on foot, actually, sergeants on foot of Windsor receive money for their services of 40 days, starting from the the reign of Henry III. The rule establishes that you cannot pretend the military service of popular militias beyond the boundaries of the originary county, if not by paying them fundamentally with money. Also, here the difference is important because they were not just paid in something, but they're starting being paid in actual money. So even in here, the monetary economy is very complicated. Actually, I'm not even a great expert about that, but it's very difficult, especially to understand it in the Middle Ages. But here also the money in itself, the coin in itself, has its very great value. At one point, it starts being a sort of guarantee or warranty of payment and in the method of payment. They're pretty significant. And in the Kingdom of France, even if many cities remain theoretically in debt towards the king, because they're traditionally owed they're traditionally obliged to perform this free military service for the king, the actual contingents that they sent to the royal army were regularly paid. So also in here, it's definitely meaningful, and it apparently naturally seems to be like that the king now had to pay, but it was effectively the only way at this point to really hire these troops, to really recruit them. So, and a similar phenomenon was appearing in the same feudal system, among the same feudatories. So not just about the cities, their militias, etc. The same proper feudatories in the feudal hierarchy. So the noblemen, etc. So not only many of them actually received salaries as a normal rule, especially once that they had performed their period of mandatory service. But it was also started to they were also being paid since the beginning of their service at one point. So it was not just a reward afterwards, but now they're beginning to ask for it from the very beginning. You can see very well this even political bargaining that existed. I mean, if you take Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, you realize that there is this by the way, the contracts, the actual pay that was required varied wildly. Like every single fief now negotiated this with the king. In Germany, for instance, you realize that because usually the Germans at this point, the royal army was committed chiefly, yes, also into Germany, but the main aim was that the big expedition was the one across the Alps to Rome, right? And most of the Germans obviously they didn't give a damn about that. They didn't want to pay, but it turns out that since the center of power of German monarchy was usually at this time towards the south of Germany, that it's very interesting because this shows you the deterrent and the effective range of the royal armies. It was usually in the north and in the east that military contingents were more difficult to be summoned for the king, while southern Germany was kind of more into control, right? And and to the king's control. And everything varied. And by the way, these practices were sometimes sedimenting like customs, right? You know, if because the king sometimes was so, like all kings in everywhere in Europe, was so desperate for rising troops that at the moment that obviously could cost him his crown or its equivalent, that he could even emanate this diploma saying, okay, from now on, let's say, I don't know, Bavaria has to give just this 60 knights, right? And therefore the Bavarian duke with that diploma could say, look, this was signed by the king, by the emperor at the time, and you know, for whichever king was elected later, you know, that was used like, this is what public power said, so you can't take it away from me. And obviously this entailed, and that's why one of the reasons, by the way, why exactly in this period, during the 12th and the 13th, especially in the 13th century proper, German monarchy starts to lose completely the grip over the German nobility at this point, and they turn, by the way, themselves into kind of nothing but, you know, private lords rather than public authorities in the practice, because it was more remunerative. Looking once again back to Sicily, in 1240, Frederick II ordered to several jurisprudents of the kingdom to choose in the various districts some in Latin are called milites strenui, that basically are these troops that there's knights that have to perform a military duty with some kind of commitment, with some kind of regularity, etc., and that had to be summoned in a given place, right? And every jurisconsult had to provide for 15 knights, another for 60, another for 40, right? So, and therefore in the various for each district, and for those knights that were selected in this fashion, it was contemplated a pay. It was equal to something like 10 ounces of gold for every 2 months. So this brings us back to the military administration of the Kingdom of Sicily, that at this point, also thanks to the legislative reforms of Frederick II, was functioning even through the participation of these jurists of lawyers that were expert. They were the ones who had to assess, in fact, in each district, even the amount of properties that the various owners had. Like to say, you of this number of knights, you this other. So it obviously was all unequal, but it was based on this kind of central control that these jurists then naturally depended on the king in this case. So you see, all various means that are being refined at this point to provide this bulk of armed forces. And then we have in France, going back to France, one roster from it's from the kingdom, the long kingdom of Saint Louis IX of France, King of France, perhaps dated to 1242. And this is very interesting because there is a list of bishoprics, lords, and knights that were probably called to for performing a free military service, right? An unpaid military service. And so in this document mentions 2 recruitings for money made into the region of Albi in Occitania, both for knights and a certain number of uh, um, of the an infantryman, actually. So these are knights with a certain number of other men of horsemen, fundamentally, because you know that the knight at this point is not just the knight itself. He has a squire that has become now by the 13th century basically equal to himself in terms of equipment, etc., and normally has other servants and aides and several horses at his own. So here you start seeing even the company, the actual military companies in embryo, right? That they're taking shape on this base because these guys were being paid. That's very meaningful. They were doing it for a service that was rewarded in that fashion. So they were probably people who were doing it for that specific aim. And it's interesting that even the infantry is already committed, obviously, and especially in southern France, where they, like kind of there were cities and urban centers with commoners, etc. So if you see, for instance, at the time of towards the end of the 13th century, under the English reign of Edward I and the French one of Philip IV, you see that the extent of the military service was made possible only through the payment of money, and there weren't many other ways, actually. It's pretty logical. It's self-explanatory, and from one side, you can't say so. Getting to the point also of the juridical and political conclusion of this, you may say, well, but this is a kind of a juridical weakening of the monarchical rights, right? Because if feudalism had been born as just as a prepaid service for which now everybody who had land now had necessarily to fight for the king as a duty, because it was effectively already paid in nature to that land. Now, what are the sovereigns doing? They're paying for money, for troops. They're paying for troops that should serve them for free, or at least with the resources that have been given. This is obviously being interpreted like that by some sources, then wanted to stress the prerogatives of the same monarchy at that time. But as a matter of fact, it was not. It was definitely a juridical weakening, and by the 13th century, it was already. By the way, it had kind of gone at its fullest, but it was definitely, first of all, not the most the moment when really the monarchy had lost this right in practice. I mean, the monarchy had lost these rights very far back in time, actually from the very times of the disgregation of Carolingian power, right? So at this point, we're just taking it back through these means that were naturally kind of private. Like, I pay you with money at this point, because the rest of the nobility had already gained by a couple of centuries now all their prerogatives, and they were like kings in their own possessions, right? So what you see here in the reverse is still on the contrary is actually a strengthening of the material, the actual economical, political and military capacities of the kings, right? And naturally, here there is this can be interesting. A passage from Pierre Dubois, who was he was definitely a royalist, and he was a French jurist. Actually, he was born in Normandy in 1255 and died in 1312. He really lived through this period. He was the counselor Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, and founder, among the founders at least, especially for the French kingdom, of the political doctrine of royalism, right? So the obvious, these doctrines that sustain the rights of a monarch or the court to exercise its juridical or theological authority. Especially if you think about the figure of Philip the Fourth, it's pretty meaningful in that. And Pierre was educated in the University of Paris. He was, by the way, a very, he had very high connections. He was in contact with Thomas Aquinas, with Siger from Brabant. He wrote several treatises, among the most diverse ones. And this one is drawn from the one called The Liberation of the Holy Land. Let me check in here. And there are other concerns he had. For example, he wrote one work about trying to find out a system to shorten the wars that at this time were increasingly more expensive. You know that even if you look at the whole monarchy of Philip IV, that some of the greatest problems now that it was towards the end of the 13th century was already the stall in European and was not contraction of European economy. So Kingdom of France at that point had, I wouldn't say overexpanded, but it definitely had known better times. Now the problem was finding money. You have to squeeze them from somewhere, from the Jews, from the Italians, from the Templars, by the way. And so this was a great moment for these theories to be, to find, at least from a royal perspective, be justified, And he was definitely a full supporter of Philip IV. He even wrote against Pope Boniface VIII in the controversy of let's say, Caesaropapism that French monarchy had acquired. Stated the Pope was an heretic. And he was, by the way, he worked shoulder to shoulder with Guillaume of Nogaret. There was also this great jurist, was most important jurist in the service of Philip, and he is, in this sense, regarded as one of those authors who paved the road, in a certain sense, to the foundation of concepts that would eventually brought to the policy, let's say the modern policy and state, right? That in France had this very precocious development, exactly because of these monarchies and passing through these actual military events that naturally required all these great financial exertions. And so here I would like to read this passage from the De Recuperazione Terrae Sancte, written actually at the very beginning of the 14th century, between 1305 1307. I'm going to not really paraphrase, but to translate in a very hoping that it sounds correct sometimes. So here it says, the Lord King Philip the Fair has to oblige. So here he's prescribing what the king should do. Actually, the Lord and King Philip the Fair has to oblige each and every one of his vassals, dukes, counts, barons, chatelains, knights, and generally those who owed to him certain determined services to render and to perform those services without scam nor reduction. He doesn't have to grant them the discount, to allow them a discount of one part, nor to neglect to pretend them, actually to demand them, to the detriment of those who have to be called only through the general proclaim of mobilization. Now, it is told that the Lord King, not keeping into account what is afore mentioned, and entrusting his person and his government to his counselors, he has taken the habit of calling sometimes for his wars at his own expense the counts, the barons, the knights, and the squires, who, having to perform the military service, should fight at their own expenses and pay off the debts of their fiefs granted them with the performance of the same service. So you understand here that the concept is very clear. Here, Pierre Dubois is backing the royal cause against those vassals, from dukes to knights and even squires, in order to make them go to war for free. So it's very ideal. It's actually very utopistic now. But first of all, what is interesting now is the historical perspective. That is, the author is assessing that there was a before and an afterwards. Like that here he is fundamentally placing during the same reign of Philip IV, but actually had a much longer history. So you have to get acquainted to the medieval source, understanding what the general meaning, however it is, and how he's approximating this. But these people should, and he says that the sovereign has begun to use, because he's been kind of brought astray by his counselors, etc., to start paying for these guys to go to war for him, while it should be the other way around, is that they are already paid by the sovereign through their holdings to go to war for him, and they don't, right? And this witness is particularly useful because you can reverse this and observe what we were saying before, that this wasn't really a bad thing, that obviously Pierre Dubois was writing to politically, in terms of propaganda. These weren't free thinkers. There was nothing like free thinking at that time. It was all framed within the ideas, especially this, if you look at these quarterly figures that had a pretty specific aim, and they were paid, in fact, even them, as the soldiers, to make this service to the king. So it's kind of ironic in the same time, but they're very meaningful, because from the other side, here the reality was probably and very likely actually very different, because both the financial and political advisors of Philip IV knew perfectly well that what they were doing by, actually not even theoretical, but practically renouncing to the rights, wasn't a big deal, because those rights now were completely theoretical, right? After half of a millennium of political disgregation of the European, of public power, at this point, finally the monarchies were basically managing to put together the whole thing. And they had managed to do it through actually the same privatization of the monarchical power through landholding and other, and the kind of the private direct control of their land, that now could give them the means to finally recruit troops on their own, that they were enough to lead finally a war even across the borders, and for a longer time than what the custom expected, right? So these advisors these politicians counselors were perfectly aware that it was impossible, first of all from a psychological, and then actually from an almost material point of view, to keep shoulder to shoulder this small number of vassals that went to war just because they against their will for an unpaid military service, and this other mass of of knights and squires of the same social and geographical extraction that received the daily money from the hands of the same functionaries and treasurers of the king. The whole system now was fluidifying in itself. You can see it in this way, that there weren't many other options, and it was advantageous for this system to spread. And this has nothing to do actually with the, as we were saying before, with the monarchical policy proper. I mean, the monarchical policy was naturally doing its own, was working for the king, for itself, but it was the actual material available, both in terms of wealth and of manpower, in the market of war, that rendered this definitely the best option, right? And it was also a way naturally to counter the same feudal nobility, because if you have an army that you can raise at your own expense, you don't have to ask your vassals for. Those vassals actually do the very exact same thing. So here the reasons why this system eventually kind of evolved in favor of the kings is something we will leave for another video. But at the same time, it's self-explanatorily the most convenient thing to do there. It was the quicker one. That's why it's also intrinsic to the use of currency in itself. As we were saying before, you just bring this money wherever you can, and you hire people that you find. And that's why there is, at this point, even in Europe, exactly in Europe, a very multinational military market. Like, it's normal for medieval armies of this time to be of several different nationalities, of these troops to come literally from everywhere, as long as they were willing to fight. And you know that money always attract people, so that even there is not just a renewed mobility, but also the increase of military, let's say, experiences, and of joint experience, common experiences, and therefore sort of homogenization of the whole organization and military traditions and tactics, etc. So this is a moment of great dynamicization. You see it in the field of tactics, where from one side the feudal cavalry is reaching its apex in terms of effectiveness of tactics, of technology. At the same time, you see a sharp rise of infantries, some other technological developments like the development of trebuchets, of crossbows. Even castles are now growing larger, stronger in stone, etc. And also at that point, that was a factor, for instance, that seemingly led to the sake of centralization, like it would happen in the modern age with cannons, etc. What you need now. Certain political entities that are big enough to pay for building for siege trains of a certain greatness, for building fortresses that can stand. So even here there is a coming together of the same nobility under, closer at least to the two kings, because they're the ones who can provide for this system. There is an increased consolidation, military administration, etc. So that's why the 13th century is such a fascinating period, and that definitely such things happen also in other tendentially in many other centuries, not just in the Middle Ages, as we were saying right now. But it's still particularly meaningful to identify in here, to recognize in this particular moment. And I would say that for today it's enough. We will keep, as always, to talk in detail about all of these things. We will expand naturally also in other topics, other times, etc. But we have a lot of things to say about medieval warfare, and not only, of course. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel or leave if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.